Wait, you're sleeping there? While my brother and his wife are on a trip, I'm house-sitting with my niece at my brother's house. As we discuss tomorrow's plans with excitement, my niece starts to open the closet door, seemingly ready for bed. Surprised, I watch her slide into the closet without hesitation. As I hurriedly grasp her arm, she looks up at me with a puzzled expression. I'm Lily. I am a 24-year-old housewife. I have a brother who is 5 years older than me. Having lost our parents, we've always been supportive of each other due to our close sibling bond. This hasn't changed even after we both got married. We still maintain a family-oriented relationship. While my husband's parents are nice, they live quite far away. A distance that requires a plane ride. Due to the long distance, something you'd typically need to fly to cover, it's not so easy to ask for his help. My brother and his wife had a shotgun wedding, but ever since his wife had a fallout with her parents, they've become estranged. Without any neighbors to turn to, we found comfort and ease in our mutually supportive relationship. Furthermore, both our families have been blessed with daughters. For years after my niece was born, my daughter Alice came along, and the girls grew up as close as real sisters. As time went by, my niece Emily was about to turn 10 when John told me about their upcoming 10th wedding anniversary trip. Would you mind looking after Emily while we're away? It's just an overnight trip nearby. We thought it would be nice to have some alone time as a couple. Seeing my brother happily blush as he spoke, I readily agreed with a hearty sure, no problem. We roughly planned out the schedule, and when I asked when I should come to pick up Emily, my brother shook his head. Apparently, my brother was concerned about leaving the house unoccupied due to security reasons and wanted me to stay over instead. Although I teased him for being a worrywart, I eventually agreed to his request, leaving my own daughter, who was still uneasy about sleepovers, in the care of my husband. Days passed uneventfully until the day of their anniversary trip, and as planned, I went to stay at my brother's house. As Emily, looking a bit nervous, watched her parents leave, I took her hand to reassure her. Now, it was just the two of us for the house sitting. Initially, I planned to bring my daughter along and just have my husband pick her up at bedtime. However, Emily was unusually adamant about not inviting her to the house, so I gave up on that plan. Of course, we had visited as a family before, but she must have had a reason for not wanting her here today. It's a shame we can't invite Alice over to play, but we really can't, Emily said with a hint of loneliness. Then how about we go to my house after breakfast tomorrow? I promised, which made her eyes light up. Having prepared some more challenging games and puzzles that even adults would enjoy, in consideration of Emily who usually played along with my daughter. I asked Emily what she'd like to play as we spread them out. We spent time playing games and preparing dinner together. However, Emily seemed nervous the entire time, sticking close to me and frequently glancing around the room. At first, I thought she was just lonely or anxious without her parents around, but her behavior remained unchanged even after several hours. When I asked if something was bothering her. But no matter how many times I asked, she just kept saying, "I'm fine. Nothing's wrong," without telling me what was bothering her. Emily's behavior was as if she was on guard against something invisible. I would come to understand its meaning only when bedtime arrived. Changing into her pajamas, Emily said with a smile, "Let's go to bed early today, and start out for Aunt Lily's house in the morning," as she opened the closet door. Inside was a set of bedding, prepared at some unknown time. As I was struggling to grasp the meaning of this, Emily quickly laid down on the mattress and attempted to close the closet door, saying, "Good night." "Wait, Emily, you're sleeping in there?" I blurted out, somewhat louder than I intended. Emily replied with a serious face. "Yes, but it's okay. I'll leave it slightly open. If anything happens, I'll wake up right away." I tried to hide my confusion as I suggested, "Why don't we sleep together tonight?" After a few tries, Emily finally agreed and reluctantly got into my bed. She asked if it was okay to keep the bedding in the closet as her hiding spot, and even though it deepened the mystery for me, I naturally agreed. I then cheerfully asked, "Why do you need a hiding place?" After she made me promise not to laugh, she whispered her answer. "The monster is coming." If that were all there was to her story, I would have thought it endearing in the way children are. However, the story that followed was enough to make me believe in the existence of the monster. Emily shivered and clung to my arm. The monster is very scary and clever. That's why it only comes when Daddy is not here. Mommy says I can't leave the closet until she has driven the monster away. She always cries while she's driving it away. I tried to help her once, but it was too scary when it pounded on the closet door. Hugging the trembling Emily, I let out a sigh inside. This monster was probably real. It probably wasn't a ploy to get a night owl kid into bed. I was caught off guard by my sister-in-law's affair, and I didn't know what to do. If the monster was her lover, it wouldn't come to this house when she wasn't here. Still, Emily believes the monster comes on the days when her father isn't home. The evidence was that today, when my brother wasn't around, she kept asking not to invite my daughter over, and never left my side, always keeping an eye on the windows and the front door. Thinking of sweet Emily and my brother who trusts his wife made me angry at my sister-in-law, but I wanted to reassure Emily more than anything else. I squeezed her hand and smiled at her. It's okay because Aunt Lily is here today. The monster is smart, right? So, it might get scared and not come in because it sees a stranger. Also, your mom who's always targeted by the monster is with your dad today, so the monster can't approach her. Still not knowing the true identity of the monster, Emily's face remained clouded with anxiety, and as time passed, she began to fear the monster's imminent arrival. I managed to calm her down as she suggested hiding in the closet together by telling her she could talk to me about anything that bothered her about the monster. I hoped that by addressing each of her concerns one by one, Emily would eventually feel sleepy. However, after hearing another fact from Emily, I couldn't sit still and ended up rushing out of the house with her still in her pajamas. I quickly drove back home, explained the situation to my husband, and then he headed to my brother's house. I had my husband and his friends stay over there. Around 10 p.m. that day, when my husband and his friends had headed over to my brother's house, I received a call from my brother, who was on vacation, asking about Emily's condition. Did Emily go to bed? Forget about your husband and daughter and get some rest yourself. Make sure to lock the doors, okay? Good night. After asking about Emily, my brother's final words were to ensure I locked up and got some sleep. I was sternly told not to leave the house, and I struggled to keep my voice steady. After hanging up, I looked at Emily, who was sound asleep with my daughter, and pledged to drive the monster away. The next morning my husband, who had stayed overnight at my brother's house, came back. My body trembled with fear and anger as he told me what happened last night. Relieved that my decision from yesterday had been the right one, I spent the rest of the day at home with Emily and my family, waiting for my brother and his wife to come pick her up. When my brother saw us, he was quick to question why Emily and I had left the house during the night. Why didn't you guys stay at the other house? I told you repeatedly not to leave our home. What were you thinking, going back to your own place after agreeing not to? My brother's strong protest that I had broken my promise was met with a surge of discomfort. I coolly asked him how he knew we weren't home while he was on vacation. My brother then responded, "I've given Emily a smartphone with a GPS function." His eyes were evasive as he answered. If that were true, then he wouldn't have insisted so persistently on the phone last night for us not to leave the house. It would have been easy for my brother to verify through the GPS that we weren't at his house. I suppressed the urge to confront my brother immediately and continue the conversation quietly, so the kids in the other room wouldn't hear. By the way, late last night 2 unfamiliar men showed up at your place. Who were they? Why would they come to a house that should only have Emily and me in the middle of the night? Intruders came? I'm glad you're safe. My brother's voice was trembling. But it wasn't out of fear for the intruders or relief that his daughter was unharmed. His gaze darted around as if carefully selecting his words. Hey, about those guys. I pressed my brother further, demanding to know who the suspicious men were. But my sister-in-law cut me off. Perhaps to prevent more questioning, she loudly called Emily over, insisting they leave. As Emily, who had been playing in the other room, timidly showed her face, her mother forcefully took her hand. Suddenly, my brother also changed his demeanor, saying, "I'm not forgiving you for this, but we're leaving for today." He started pushing Emily towards the door. My brother and his wife forcefully tried to take Emily, who clearly did not want to leave, back home with them. "What? We're not done talking yet." I tried to stop them, but they just ignored me, not even bothering to look back. Emily, resisting her parents, reached out towards me. I quickly pulled her towards me, sheltering her behind my back. "Hey! What do you think you're doing?" My sister-in-law raised her voice in surprise, letting go of Emily's hand, but I kept Emily behind me, away from my brother and his wife. They spat aggressive words at us and rushed over, fueled by anger. My husband and I were determined not to let them take Emily and managed to force them out of the room. At the front door, waiting police officers swiftly apprehended my brother and his wife. The police tried to calm the disoriented couple, who were clearly not expecting this turn of events. Understanding their predicament, my brother argued, "If you don't give us back our daughter, then you should be the ones getting detained." My sister-in-law added, "They took our daughter from home and locked her up here. Please save Emily right away." "You shouldn't be holding me back. I won't run or hide, so let me go," my brother shouted. Emily and my daughter, who had noticed the commotion and come out, were talking behind me, looking surprised. My daughter innocently remarked, "She doesn't seem locked up at all." I'm not sure whether my brother heard her or not, but he turned to Emily and commanded her to come to him in a strong tone. Yet, the severity of her father's demeanor scared her, and she refused to leave my side. My sister-in-law stood silently by the police officer, just watching my brother, not even trying to call Emily over. My brother, irate that things weren't going his way, was yelling in the entrance, completely restrained by the police officer. Seeing this, my husband pushed his smartphone in front of my brother's face. Noticing this, I told Emily and my daughter to wait once more in the other room and shut the door so they wouldn't hear the audio. After confirming this, my husband started playing a video he had recorded at my brother's house the night before, without uttering a word. Upon seeing it, the faces of my brother and his wife immediately turned pale. The video started with a key slowly turning in the lock of the house. It seemed they'd used a spare key. Two men quietly entered the room. The men, appearing in high spirits, greeted each other, mentioning my brother's name, didn't know we had company. "Hey, how much did you pay?" "He told me it was a 30% discount 'cause she's his sister." One of them smirked, looking over at my husband and his friends. When my husband's friend gave a vague response, avoiding the question, one of the men boasted that because they were good friends with my brother and his wife, they got an even bigger discount, even going as far as mentioning a specific amount. They continued, "We're lucky we get to play with the kids today." The profile of the man who laughed was so grotesque, it would be an insult to demons to call him one. I couldn't see the screen, but the audio alone was enough to make my skin crawl. Afterwards, my husband's friend started barraging the men with questions, asking if they often came to this house, if they always came as a pair. Sensing something was off, the men asked where Emily and I were. Seeing my husband's enraged expression as he responded, "They're not here," it seemed they finally realized the gravity of the situation. Realizing they weren't among friends here, the men quickly fled. Until the very end, they were either unaware of my husband's recording or deliberately didn't mention it. My brother, supposed to be their close acquaintance, seemed to have discovered the existence of the video for the first time and was shaking. My brother, now deathly pale, frantically stated, "I didn't know anything, I've been framed." I had thought until watching this video that my brother was uninvolved and that my sister-in-law was the mastermind behind everything. However, the video contained clear evidence of my brother offering up Emily and me. His ignorance won't convince anyone. My brother was taken away by the police, and my sister-in-law feigned ignorance of the situation. But the police officer, who had already heard Emily's testimony, asked her to accompany him because he had many questions to ask her. Thus, they ended up in custody together. At a later date, the police interrogated my brother and his wife, who ended up confessing everything and were subsequently arrested. It turns out my sister-in-law would lure men into their home on the nights my brother worked late shifts and receive money from them. Realizing there was a demand for children among certain groups, she carefully exploited Emily in a way that wouldn't run afoul of the law. Emily, who knew nothing and was trying to help her bullied mother, was photographed posing as she was told. The pictures were merely innocent photos of a child. Yet, my sister-in-law would go out of her way to take these simple photos with a disposable camera, develop them, and show them to her customers, inducing a bidding war, as though at an auction. What's more, she only lent out the photos, she never sold them. As despicable as this was, it should have had nothing to do with my husband and me. When my brother became aware of his wife's business, he didn't scold her or protect his daughter. Instead, unbelievably, he started gathering men to become customers. More staff meant more revenue. With such a simple mindset, my brother decided to involve me in the business. Of course, I would never agree to it if he simply asked me. So, my brother thought to force me to work and continued to threaten me by taking photos of the scene. And so, they carefully chose a day when the neighbors wouldn't be around and locked Emily and me in their house. They exchanged the spare key to their home for a large sum of money and went out of town for an overnight trip, just to prove they weren't involved. What my brother and his wife didn't expect was that Emily, who had always obeyed my sister-in-law without question, regretted telling me about the monsters to protect me. Emily didn't understand most of what was happening in the house, but she did understand that the monsters were targeting them. By telling me, she brought the hellish situation at my brother's house to light. That night, when I learned about Emily's predicament, I asked my husband to capture the image of these so-called monsters. They carelessly leaked a lot of information, so the police acted promptly when we reported it. We also reported it to Child Protective Services, making sure to protect Emily. When we told the police officer about my brother and his wife coming to our house, they were able to secure Emily from them. My brother and his wife were arrested on serious charges such as child welfare law violations and violations of laws preventing child exploitation. Despite being first-time offenders, they could not avoid imprisonment. The photos of a child they had been taking over several years were considered highly malicious. Once an image is leaked on the internet, it can never be erased. I was shocked when the police told me this, but fortunately, my sister-in-law had not digitized or sold Emily's photos, and they were securely stored, preventing any leakage. I don't understand how my brother, who had been kind and reliable to me, could have become such a terrible person. We had been helping each other out as usual until then. The fact that I didn't notice this distortion scares me. Anyway, I want them to face what they've done. Following the arrest of my brother and his wife, the so-called monsters were also brought in for questioning by the police. They apparently argued their innocence, claiming that because their plans had not been successful, they weren't guilty. However, it seems that the discovery of someone else's child's photographs at their residence, and their involvement in other criminal acts confessed by my brother and his wife during their interrogations, led to them also being arrested on multiple charges. After we took care of the monsters lurking in our lives, we went to the Child Protective Services to inquire about Emily's situation. Her parents were arrested, leaving her without anyone to care for her. In fact, they were unfit to be guardians in the first place, so custody of Emily was taken away from my brother and his wife. That said, neither my brother nor I have any living parents, and my sister-in-law's family is completely estranged. We learned that if no one from my sister-in-law's family would agree to take her in, Emily would be taken in by foster parents. After talking it over with my husband, we decided to adopt Emily. To me, Emily is not only someone I'm greatly indebted to, but also a girl I've grown to love as my own daughter. The thought of leaving her was simply unbearable. Luckily, my husband agreed and we saw this as an opportunity to move to my in-laws' town. Our daughter, who loves her grandparents and has always wanted an older sister, is overjoyed. She's been excitedly looking forward to the weekend, when she could see her grandparents more often, and now her wish of having Emily, who she adores, as her big sister came true. And as for Emily, who finally got out of the clutches of her abusive parents, she's adapting incredibly well to her new environment as an older sister. It's amazing how resilient kids can be. she's beginning to lead a happy and peaceful life. It's my house. Obey me. No matter what you say, Mom is going to live in this house. As soon as I strongly opposed the idea of my mother-in-law living in our home, my husband, Jack, burst into anger like a raging fire and said that. I frowned and replied, but this house was handed down to me by my parents. Why is Jack boasting that it's his house when it's mine? However, I tried to have a decent conversation, but if Jack kept taking an authoritative attitude, thinking he could make me obey him, he raised his voice and said, I'm the one paying the rent. So this house is mine. It's not yours. I was at a loss for words. I'm not even having you pay for it. As I couldn't say anything, Jack thought he had one, snorted, and plopped down on the living room sofa. I let out a big sigh. My name is Amy. I currently live with my daughter, Sarah, who is going to be an 8th grader, and my husband, Jack. We live in a 2-story house, and Jack and I started living in this house about 3 years after we got married. Originally, my parents lived in this house, but they decided to give up the house and move to the countryside, saying they had something they wanted to do there. At that time, my parents decided to rent this house to us, Jack and I, who were married and had Sarah in my belly. I suppose my parents were concerned about their income even though they had moved to the countryside. Well, it was cheaper than living in an apartment or buying a new house, so Jack and I were happy to pay the rent. I work as a magazine editor and make a decent amount of money. Originally, I was an editor for a fashion magazine, but now I've been entrusted with being the editor-in-chief of other magazines. I've always enjoyed thinking about the writing and design in magazines, so this job is like a calling for me. By the way, I met my husband, Jack, through work, during a meeting. He was a photographer. His style was to shoot anything he thought was nice, be it landscapes or people, and then ask for it to be published in a magazine. Well, there aren't many times that what he shoots and what the editorial department wants to post coincide. So, I guess I earn more. In fact, he's a freelance photographer, so he's not stable in terms of income and can't be relied upon. In the midst of that, we ended up raising our daughter, Sarah. I'm busy with my work in the editorial department, but since Jack is a freelance photographer, he doesn't go out when he doesn't feel like it, and he has no work or anything. So I left our little daughter to Jack. I have a stable income, so I thought it was only natural to divide the roles like this, but there was someone who outright rejected our role division. That was Jack's mother. For me, she's my mother-in-law. My mother-in-law didn't necessarily believe in male superiority over women, but she had a personality that couldn't tolerate her own son taking care of the child or doing household chores. So when she found out that I was working outside and that Jack was taking care of the child and doing housework at home, she became furious. Why is my Jack doing all the wife's work when she's out having a break? I was surprised at that. Jack had been living at home until he married me, so my mother-in-law should have known that he was a freelance photographer and didn't have a stable income. However, it seemed that how much Jack was earning didn't matter to my mother-in-law. What mattered to her was whether her precious only son was not having a hard time. Excuse me, I'm not just taking a break outside. I'm working hard outside every day. I'm just having Jack look after Sarah while I'm gone. When I came home after finishing my work, my mother-in-law was standing like a statue in the doorway waiting for me, and I was really surprised. My mother-in-law's house is a 3-hour drive away, so I thought she wouldn't come so easily. But she must have been worried about her son Jack. As soon as she came to our house while I was gone, she began to lecture me immediately. You know, even if you say you're working outside, you're married to Jack, right? You have to think of Jack first, you know? And yet you're pushing child-rearing and housework onto Jack. If this was going to happen, you shouldn't have had a child. I inadvertently reacted to my mother-in-law's words with a huh? I somehow knew that my mother-in-law disliked me. After all, her son was the most important person to her, so she probably resented me, the bride who stole her son through marriage. Even so, I thought she would cherish her son's married life and the child born between her son and me. But it seems I was wrong about that. My mother-in-law really only cared about her son, Jack, and considered everyone else a nuisance. On top of disliking me, she started saying she didn't need my daughter, Sarah, either. Finally, she grinned and looked towards the living room where Sarah was, saying, "If you're gonna keep bothering Jack, we might have to think about sending Sarah somewhere to be adopted." I was instantly irritated by her words and told her clearly, "Please leave." My mother-in-law, already disliking me, frowned and said, "What are you saying to your husband's mother?" But I grabbed her arm and said, "Mother-in-law or not, you're an outsider to this house. Who do you think you are, telling me to give up my dear child for adoption? We won't associate with you anymore, so leave." I then took her outside, escorted her to the gate, and immediately closed the door behind me. She made a fuss in front of the house for a while, but I ignored it. During that time, Jack was doing what, you might ask? Well, since his mother came over, he left everything to her, including taking care of Sarah and the house chores, and he himself was sound asleep in bed. Well, it seems his mother must have thought, why do I have to do the wife's work? She didn't do any housework and completely neglected Sarah's care. I rushed to Sarah and made dinner for her. While Jack was still asleep, I called my father-in-law. Unlike my mother-in-law, who valued only her son and didn't listen to anyone else's opinions, my father-in-law was a reasonable person. When I told him everything about how my mother-in-law had barged into our house, lectured me absurdly, and even said to put Sarah up for adoption, he was as angry as I was and came to pick her up right away. "You don't have to deal with the relatives much anymore. I'll make sure my wife stays away from this house too," said my father-in-law, grabbing his wife by the scruff of her neck, who was screaming, "Why do I have to be yelled at? This woman married Jack, didn't she? Then she should serve Jack and listen to what I say too, and put her in the car. Enough already. Do you want to make your own son good for nothing? Our grandchild was just born, and now everything is ruined because of you." My father-in-law was angry. Of course, my father-in-law wants to love his grandchild. Nevertheless, my father-in-law saying minimal interaction with relatives is fine was probably to protect me and Sarah. I can only thank my father-in-law. Then, we stopped seeing my in-laws so often, no big incidents happened, and when Sarah was in 8th grade, something happened. Shockingly, my father-in-law had passed away. He had been complaining about feeling unwell for several days, so he was on his way to the hospital when he lost consciousness. He was rushed to the hospital, but it seems luck was not on his side. Suddenly, my father-in-law's death saddened me. Of course, Jack, who lost his real father, was also sad. And even though she hadn't been interacting with the relatives, Sarah, who had continued to correspond with her grandfather in 8th grade, was very upset. Since they were pen pals, Sarah might have been sadder than me. After all, I couldn't help but think, who's going to stop my mother-in-law now? While it's sad that my father-in-law passed away, the fact that there is now no one to stop that reckless and hateful mother-in-law who dislikes both me and Sarah is very frightening. In the future, my mother-in-law might storm into our house. After all, until now, even if she tried to come to our house, my father-in-law had been strictly managing the money so she wouldn't have the travel expenses, and had even made her give up her driver's license. But now, my father-in-law's inheritance is hers, and no one around to tell her how to use that inheritance. It seemed as though my fears had come true when my mother-in-law approached us as the funeral ended and relatives gathered, declaring, "I'm going to move into your house soon." Certainly, since my father-in-law has passed away, my mother-in-law will be living alone in her house. However, even so, I absolutely cannot agree to live with my mother-in-law, who sees me and Sarah as nuisances. Especially considering that Sarah is in a sensitive period of adolescence, being in 8th grade. "I'm sorry, but living together is impossible," I firmly refused, and my mother-in-law glared at me as if she were going to spit at me. Then, she put her hand on Jack's arm and said in a frail, elderly voice, "Jack, you really married a cold-hearted wife, didn't you? I want to talk to you alone." She then separated Jack from us. Next to me, Sarah let out a big sigh and said, "Grandma is really a troublesome person. Grandpa used to say that in his letters. If it's good for her, she doesn't care about those around her. That's why there's been trouble for a long time." Saying that, Sarah just shrugged her shoulders. In the past, Sarah used to be attached to Jack, who took care of her, but recently she seems to have realized that it's me who is earning money and supporting the household. She has come to favor me over her father. Well, Jack still sees Sarah as a little girl, so I guess it makes sense that they don't see eye to eye, since Sarah wants to grow up quickly. Hey, Sarah. Mom really thinks it's impossible to live with your grandma. But what if Dad and Grandma ignore what I say and try to live together in the house? I said, hesitating to tell her the whole story. Because what I'm about to say is a heavy topic for a middle schooler like Sarah. Considering Sarah's feelings, I also felt that making such a decision might be wrong. However, Sarah seemed more mature than I thought, and she said, if you're going to divorce Dad, I'm definitely going with you, Mom. It seems that Sarah immediately caught on to what I was trying to say about possibly divorcing her father. Moreover, I was truly happy that Sarah said she would side with me. But having a daughter in middle school, I thought it might be better to keep the family together until Sarah graduates from college. But it seemed that Sarah had also noticed my hesitation. You know, Mom. I think it's okay for you to leave if you can't bear it. And I can't stand Grandma either, so if staying with Dad means having Grandma around, I think divorce is the only option, Sarah said firmly, indicating her willingness to leave her father. I think the last time Sarah and my mother-in-law met was when Sarah was very small, so maybe she remembers the unpleasant attitude my mother-in-law showed her at that time? I found out for the first time that Sarah disliked my mother-in-law so much. While surprised, I thought to myself, that's right. Living with such a person would be worse for Sarah than divorcing. But Jack, who had been talking to my mother-in-law alone, seemed to have a completely different idea, and as soon as we got home from the funeral, Jack said to me, I'm going to live with Mom. But my opinion hasn't changed since the old days. I absolutely refuse. Living with your mother, even if the world turns upside down, is unthinkable. Even though I firmly refused to live with my mother-in-law, Jack glared at me, saying that he couldn't back down because she's his mother. This is my house. Obey me. No matter what you say, I'm going to have Mom live in this house. It felt more like a command to me, his wife, rather than a request to live with his mother. Maybe when he was talking to his mother alone, she told him something like make your wife obey? That would be just like her. I frowned upon hearing that and said, this is the house I inherited from my parents. Why is my husband acting like it's his house when it's mine? But, while I was trying to have a proper conversation, my husband was taking an aggressive attitude as if he could control me by doing so, raising his voice, I'm the one paying the rent. Then this house is mine. Not yours. I was speechless. Though he's not the one paying for it. While I was unable to say anything, my husband, perhaps thinking he had one, snorted and heavily sat down on the living room couch. I let out a big sigh. Why is Jack under the impression that he's the one paying the rent for this house? I thought for a bit. I'm the one paying the rent for this house. Moreover, this house is something I'm renting from my parents, and I'm the one that made the contract. In this agreement, Jack is considered an outsider. And Jack's only financial contribution every month is the savings for Sarah. As you know, Jack is a freelance photographer and doesn't have a stable income. So, I thought it would be risky to leave him in charge of things that must absolutely be paid every month, such as groceries and electric bills, and instead had told him to put money into savings for Sarah, which didn't have to be paid every month but would be better if saved. I think Jack had been putting in $300 to $500 every month into that account. Perhaps he's thinking that's the rent? Thinking this, I shook my head and said, no. There's no way he could make such a misunderstanding, I thought, but no matter how much I thought about it, the only money Jack has been paying, aside from Sarah's birthday presents and other unexpected expenses, is about that. Rent is something that has to be paid every month, so there's no way he's confusing that with the rent. What on earth is this man misunderstanding? I thought, and immediately talked to Sarah. Sarah, who had apparently been listening to Jack and me in the hallway outside the living room, shrugged her shoulders and said, it's hopeless now. I heard from Grandpa, but Dad's been spoiled rotten by Grandma, thinking everyone around him will do as he says. My father-in-law used to say something to the effect of, do you intend to make my son a good-for-nothing, when he came to our house to pick up my mother-in-law, and I finally understood what he meant. The more my mother-in-law spoiled Jack, the more Jack would become a good-for-nothing. And, as a result, this had affected us in the worst way. Divorce has been decided between Sarah and me, but that aside, my mother-in-law is going to barge into our house. In that case, other measures will be necessary. I found out the day my mother-in-law was coming from Jack and told my parents. It's only natural. The owners of this house are my parents, and currently, they are renting it out to our family, so if my mother-in-law arbitrarily says, "I'm going to live here," we'll have to call the owners of the house. An hour before my mother-in-law was due to arrive, my parents arrived at the house, and Jack was in a panic, saying, "Why are Amy's parents coming to the house?" Even though he's under the mistaken impression that he's paying the rent, he must understand that this house belongs to my parents and that I'm just borrowing it now, so that's probably why he's panicking. I've properly told my parents about what's happened, so my parents have been giving Jack stern looks from the beginning, saying, "Jack, you are Amy's husband and Sarah's father." Yet, even though they both are strongly against it, you seem to be forcibly trying to have your mother live with you. "And that mother is coming here today," my father said to a trembling Jack, who answered, "But, Dad passed away." My father continued, "So what? Just because she's alone? There are other ways if she's lonely, but you are neglecting the family you should protect and calling your mother to this house. Then we have no choice but to evict you from this house." "What? Why? This house was handed over to my daughter, not you. My daughter seems to be going to divorce you, and we won't let you and your mother live here." Jack looked at me in surprise, but quickly snorted. "I'm the one paying the rent, how can you allow this?" But reality was different. My father sighed and said, "I have been receiving the rent from my daughter every month. I've never received it from you," and Jack's eyes widened. When I said to Jack, "Could it be that you thought you were transferring money to my dad's account, when you were actually putting it into the account for Sarah?" Jack began to hold his head on the spot, recalling his actions at the time of the transfer. It finally dawned on him that the account he'd been putting money into was not his father-in-law's, but the one he'd made for his daughter. Both my parents and I were dumbfounded by his series of actions. After a while, his mother-in-law came to our house. She arrived in high spirits, but upon seeing my parents standing like sentinels at the front door, waiting for her, she suddenly became nervous. When my parents spoke about Jack's and my divorce, the mother-in-law joyfully said, "Finally, Jack's free from that horrible wife," but when they explained that Jack would be kicked out right away because the house was not his, she turned pale and exclaimed, "What? I sold my house? I thought we could live here." Though she said this, my father and mother adamantly refused to let her in, and eventually, she broke down crying and ran away somewhere. Jack also ran after his mother like that. While they were gone, we called a locksmith to change the locks. Now neither Jack's mother nor Jack will be able to enter the house without our knowledge. I immediately had a lawyer proceed with the divorce, and I became a single mother. Sarah also said about our divorce, "It was a bold decision, but I think it was good. Dad hasn't been taking photos at all lately, and he was becoming a bum. Plus, if Grandma was added, I think my college fund would have been used." After the divorce, it seems Jack and his mother-in-law have started living in a cheap, run-down apartment. The mother-in-law, realizing that they can't live on Jack's earnings, is now working diligently at a part-time job, but someday, that life will probably collapse. Well, it's none of our business. Right now, my daughter and I are living happily together. Huh? Charles is on a business trip too. I've heard Charles is out of town for work. I haven't heard anything about his trip getting shorter. The lights have been on every night, though. Neighbor gave a puzzled look. Things got a bit awkward between the two of us, but the neighbor just went back to their house. I wonder what's going on. Charles was supposed to be on a business trip for a week, and it doesn't make sense for him to be home without letting me know. As I thought about it, I came up with a possible explanation. So, I called Linda, my mother-in-law, and made a suggestion. "Can you and your husband come over to our house secretly? Charles's birthday is coming up soon, and I want to surprise him." Linda replied, Of course, honey. A surprise sounds so thrilling. We'll head over shortly, just hang tight for us. With that, she hung up. All right. Things are about to get interesting. I grinned. My name's Jennifer, and I'm turning 33 this year. Charles and I have been married for 3 years. We met at the company we used to work at. We don't have kids yet. I only switched jobs a year ago. I'm still getting the hang of my job, and I'm worried about inconveniencing the company if I were to take maternity leave right away. So, I want to get more comfortable with my work first before thinking about having kids. I changed jobs to further develop my skills. Charles and I were in the same sales department, him being my senior. I often sought advice from Charles whenever I couldn't meet my sales targets. He even accompanied me on major client appointments. We grew closer as I consulted with him regularly. And soon we were dining out and hanging out together, building a close relationship. Then one day, during one of our usual dinner outings, Charles suddenly proposed. I'm in love with you, Jennifer. I want you to marry me. Having trusted him through our work together, I replied, I'd be happy to. The joy on Charles's face when I accepted was unforgettable. He thanked me repeatedly, saying, Thank you. I'm gonna make you the happiest woman alive. Seeing Charles so elated, I felt sure of the happiness that lay ahead. We live not too far from Charles's parents, who reside in the next town over. It's a comfortable distance for me, better than living with them, at least. At the beginning of our marriage, they weren't too thrilled about my job. Because they believed that my dedication to work might delay us starting a family. Jennifer, don't you want kids soon? Maybe you don't have to work that hard, you know. Every time I met her, my mother-in-law would repeat this like it was her catchphrase. My father-in-law, perhaps eager for a grandchild, would always tell me, I want to hold my grandchild. Charles is my only child, so you're our only hope, Jennifer. My father-in-law had just retired from a regular office job, and my mother-in-law was a stay-at-home mom. Charles was an only child, making them a family of 3. Perhaps because Charles is their only child, it seems they expect me to have several children. I think they might also want an heir. Charles wants a lot of kids, right? I've overheard my father-in-law asking Charles this question numerous times, and my mother-in-law would say things like, I'll be there to help raise the kids with Jennifer. You can rely on us anytime. Charles probably got used to his parents' comments. He would only respond with, Thanks. Well, kids are a blessing, and we can't tell when they'll come to us. He never really defended me, so there were times I honestly didn't want to visit my in-laws. But they aren't bad people. I made some homemade roast beef for you. I remember you said you liked it. I hope you like it. My mother-in-law would often say, bringing me some of her dishes. I admire my mother-in-law for being able to make homemade roast beef, and I genuinely appreciate the delicious food. My father-in-law has his good sides too. Sometimes he would quietly hand me some pocket money, saying, It's not much. I'm not sure if he does the same for Charles. It's nice that he'd give it to me, his daughter-in-law. With such in-laws, I've managed to maintain a relationship of neither being too close nor too distant. However, the pressure for a grandchild from them isn't my only concern. My work has its own set of challenges. Especially with business trip. The company I switched to requires a lot of business trips. At my previous job, female employees had some considerations, so long trips were limited. But it's different now. Perhaps because it's a sales job for construction materials. There are frequent trips. With all products developed in-house, clients are spread across the country, from New York to California. Regularly hopping from one place to another is the norm for proposal sales. Initially, I knew nothing about construction materials, so it was tough. Moreover, most of the business clients are men. At times, some would be dismissive, almost implying, I can't discuss this with a woman. Being brushed off or not taken seriously was a regular occurrence. However, when a company accepts my proposal, the satisfaction is immense. And when I visit a completed building using our products, it's an inspiring experience that boosts my motivation. But, as I felt more accomplished in my job, the number of trips increased proportionally. Lately, I've been traveling once or twice a month, ranging from short 2-day trips to ones lasting over a week. Some months, I'm barely home due to business trips. It seems my in-laws are not happy with this. One day, when visiting my in-laws with Charles, my mother-in-law sternly questioned, "Jennifer, what do you think of Charles? Don't you want to stay home and cook for him?" She must have been worried about her son. Especially since she's been a stay-at-home mom her entire life, she probably assumed that it's only natural for a woman to prioritize the household. After that, I got an hour-long lecture from her. During this, my father-in-law just sat there, looking extremely awkward, like he'd become part of the furniture. Maybe Charles felt sorry for me getting grilled by his mom, because he jumped in to defend me. "Jennifer's been working hard, you know. I'm often away on business trips, so please, don't be so hard on her." And Charles gave me a reassuring pat on my shoulder. My mother-in-law seemed surprised, probably not expecting Charles to stick up for me. Maybe she thought she was conveying her son's feelings to me. "Well, if Charles says so," she remarked, sounding resigned. Seeing her act like this made me think that she really must love and worry about her son deeply. That was an eventful day. I had spent most of that week on a business trip in Chicago. Initially, I had planned for a week, but my proposal to the client went smoother than anticipated, so I was able to come home 2 days earlier. I was thrilled about this unexpected change, but when I had informed Charles about my business trip schedule, he said, "My trip's gonna be the exact same time as yours. So don't worry, just do your best, Jennifer." So, Charles shouldn't be home yet. Although I was glad to be back early, I felt a tad lonely thinking I'd be alone at home. However, as I approached the house, something felt off. To my surprise, I noticed the lights were on, particularly in our bedroom on the second floor. As I stood there, dumbfounded, neighbor called out to me, "Jennifer! I'm so sorry about yesterday." Neighbor is a young woman in her early 20s. She is living with her husband and baby. "Yesterday? What happened?" I was caught off guard and must have looked puzzled. Neither Charles nor I were home yesterday, so there's no reason for her to apologize. Then the neighbor started explaining. "For the past few days, my baby has been crying a lot during the night. You must have heard it, right? I was worried that we might have disturbed your sleep." She looked genuinely apologetic and concerned. However, I thought there must be some misunderstanding. Huh? Charles is on a trip. I had heard from Charles that he was away. And he hadn't mentioned anything about returning early. Really? The lights were on every night. I think they've been on every night for the past week. Sometimes, when my baby is crying at night, I carry him out to the balcony to soothe him. Our balcony faces your house directly, so I thought maybe you haven't been on business trips lately. Neighbor looked surprised. It created an awkward atmosphere between us, but then neighbor was called by her child from inside her house and went straight back home. What's going on? I was increasingly puzzled. Charles was supposed to be on a business trip this week. It's impossible for him to be home without notifying me. The reason I think so is that Charles can't cook at all. In the past, I would prepare a lot of meals in advance and freeze them. If I didn't get the food ready to just microwave, Charles wouldn't be able to eat. Suddenly, I wondered if he might have gone back to his parents' place. I decided to call Linda, my mother-in-law, to check. "Hey Linda, has Charles been coming over for dinner all this week?" I asked as soon as she picked up the phone. "No, he hasn't been here," Linda replied with a surprised tone. "That's strange. If he didn't go back home, what was he doing for dinner?" As I thought about it, one reason came to mind. Then, I made a suggestion to Linda on the phone. "Can you and your husband secretly come over? Charles's birthday is coming up soon, and I want to surprise him." Linda replied, "Of course, honey. A surprise sounds so thrilling. We'll head over shortly, just hang tight for us." I knew she wouldn't hesitate to come. She's the kind of person who doesn't think too deeply about things. Alright, this is gonna be exciting. I grinned slightly. Jennifer, we are here. About 15 minutes later, my mother-in-law came, bringing along my father-in-law. They both must really love their adorable son, Charles. Perhaps it's because I mentioned a surprise for Charles beforehand, but they had such excited expressions on their faces. What's the surprise gonna be? My father-in-law asked me with a slightly playful tone. Charles thinks I'm still on a business trip and haven't come home yet. He must be feeling lonely by himself right now. So, I thought we could all sneak into the house and give Charles a little surprise. I was thinking of ordering everyone's favorite Chinese dim sum for dinner later. How does that sound? I shared the plan I had thought of before my in-laws arrived. Of course, I have a different motive, and there's a hidden agenda to the plan I shared with them. However, it doesn't seem like my in-laws suspect my surprise plan at all. Sounds fun! Everyone loves Chinese, so let's order the premium stuff. It'll be on me. My father-in-law said with a sudden smile. Should we also get some wine later? Charles will surely be surprised. My mother-in-law seemed genuinely pleased. Seeing my in-laws so genuinely joyful made me feel a bit guilty. Thinking about what might happen next, which could steal away their smiles, made me feel a bit uneasy. However, I managed to suppress those feelings and, without showing any emotion on my face, said, "Shall we go then? From here on, it's a surprise, so please be quiet, both of you." I then quietly unlocked the door and we all entered. There was no light in the entrance, but the outside brightness made things somewhat visible. That's when I noticed. As I had suspected, a pair of red high heels that weren't mine, neatly placed side by side. At that moment, my face went blank, but my in-laws didn't notice. When I glanced at their faces, they still seemed thrilled. They were probably imagining Charles's surprised face, unable to hide their smiles. We then quietly made our way up the stairs towards the bedroom on the second floor. Light was seeping from the bedroom, and there was a faint presence of someone inside. As we got closer, we could hear voices. I pretty much guessed what was happening, so I wasn't shocked. However, my in-laws were probably puzzled to hear voices coming from a room where Charles was supposed to be alone. They both looked a bit bewildered. Without a word, I went up the rest of the stairs and opened the bedroom door. As expected, Charles was in the bedroom. "Jennifer! Why are you here?" Charles said, looking surprised. "I finished my business trip early and came home." "What's going on here?" I spoke to Charles. Next to Charles was a familiar-looking woman. "Well..." Charles seemed at a loss for words. "That figures." The woman with Charles was Linda, who worked at the same company as Charles as a receptionist. I used to work at the same company as Charles before I switched jobs, so I recognized Linda's face. She's younger than me and had just started right out of college. Her hair was brown and beautifully curled. Her nails and clothes were on point, showing she put effort into her appearance. However, even when I was at our old company, Linda had a reputation. And not in a good way. With her looks, it's no surprise Linda is a receptionist. She's very cute. She probably doesn't struggle to find boyfriends. But Linda has a bit of a manipulative side. Rumors had it that she'd frequently switch between men she was dating. A good friend of mine, who secretly dated someone from our company, lamented how Linda managed to snatch him away at some point. That time, I had to listen to my colleague vent till the last train, and all I could do was console her. After hearing such things multiple times, I couldn't help but see Linda as an enemy among women. As I was lost in those thoughts, Linda spoke. "Isn't that Jennifer?" "What a coincidence," she said cheerily. She seemed utterly unaware of doing anything wrong. "Linda, do you realize what you're doing? Charles is my husband, you know." I asked Linda, trying to keep my cool. Though I was a tad irritated, I did my best to hide it. Linda chuckled and said, "Of course I knew. I originally worked at the same company with you, and I tend to want things even more when they belong to someone else." Saying this, she teased me. Twirling her hair with her fingers, she looked at me with a mischievous grin. Indeed, Linda was just as wild as the rumors suggested. She didn't seem fazed by the situation at all. In fact, she seemed to be enjoying the drama. I wonder if Charles couldn't stand this atmosphere. Charles hesitated and began to speak to me. Sorry, Jennifer, you've been traveling a lot lately. I've been kinda lonely, and eating microwaved meals alone just isn't the same. Then Linda said she'd cook for me and take care of me, so I just... When I glanced at Charles, his cheeks were slightly flushed. He must be gradually falling for Linda. I let out a heavy sigh and said, So, that's the situation. What should we do, mother-in-law, father-in-law? Addressing my in-laws, who were visibly shocked by the unexpected turn of events. My in-laws were standing near the stairs, out of Charles and Linda's view. My father-in-law stood with his mouth wide open in shock. Why are Mom and Dad here? Charles hurriedly approached and was bewildered when he saw his parents near the stairs. You mean these are Charles's parents? Why are they suddenly here? Even Linda seemed taken aback. She probably hadn't expected not only me, but also his parents to be present. Jennifer planned a surprise for Charles, right? So why are you doing this? My mother-in-law was in tears over Charles's indiscretion. This was just too much for her. What the hell? You don't care about Jennifer and you're cheating on her. My father-in-law shouted at Charles, trembling with rage. My in-laws have always been close, and I've never seen them fight. This situation was probably unimaginable for them. While I was thinking about this, Charles started complaining to me. Jennifer, why'd you call Mom and Dad? It's totally uncool to drag my parents into this. Charles glared at me. It seems that I'm to blame for everything because I called his parents. Linda sided with Charles and said, That's so low of you, Jennifer. My in-laws seemed quite irritated by Charles and Linda's remarks. After all, it's clear to anyone that the one cheating is in the wrong. My father-in-law was so angry, his face was so red. Aren't the worst ones Charles and Linda? Not just Charles, but it's totally unreasonable for him to cheat in the house I live in too, I said, looking straight into their eyes. I countered firmly. Just because you were on a business trip, huh? It's my house too, I did nothing wrong. Charles replied defiantly. Linda nodded in agreement. My house, you say? Do you even know who owns this house? I asked Charles. In a smug manner, Charles responded. Isn't it ours? It's clearly property shared between the two of us. I sighed deeply. No, it's in my name. Remember when you couldn't get approved for the mortgage because you had too many credit card debts? That's why it had to be in my name. Plus, you haven't paid your share of the mortgage. Ever since we moved in, I've been the one paying for everything. Neither of Charles's parents knew about this. They both looked quite shocked. They probably assumed Charles was taking care of the payments. Quick to defend himself, Charles said. All right, maybe you're right about the house. But I've been covering car maintenance and groceries, haven't I? You've had it easier financially because of that. I was taken aback by Charles's argument. Charles mentioned about car maintenance, but he is the only person uses car. Today he used his car for commuting, but I usually take the train. Most of the time, I travel for work, using planes and trains, so I don't really feel the need for a car. The train station is within walking distance, so I have no issues getting around. So, you are the only one using the car, right? And about the groceries, I usually do the shopping at the grocery store. Are you saying the groceries are for Linda? That has nothing to do with me, does it? Charles's face turned a shade redder, seemingly having hit a nerve. I was utterly disappointed, and it seemed his parents felt the same. They were both at a loss for words. Anyway, a divorce between you and I is what's best, right? I'll be seeking monetary compensation for my mental suffering from both you and Linda. Also, since this house is mine, could you both leave right now? The mention of divorce changed the color of Charles's face. Hearing about my mental suffering, Linda went pale. Jen, you're joking about the divorce and suing us, right? I wouldn't be able to make it on my own," Charles said, going pale. Considering how Charles has been spending his money, his reaction was not surprising. "You've hardly contributed to our household finances since we got married. I bet you spent it on having fun with Linda or on whatever you felt like," I pointed out. Charles fell silent. Linda seemed taken aback by Charles's behavior. Then my father-in-law, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "Jennifer, we're truly sorry. We had no idea Charles had been causing you so much trouble." My father-in-law seemed genuinely remorseful. And then my mother-in-law addressed me. "The reason Jennifer has been working so hard is because Charles wasn't contributing to the household. We truly don't know what to say. We're so sorry." My mother-in-law was on the verge of tears. Charles's negligence must have been a shock to them. Speaking to Charles's parents, I said, "I've tried to make it work because I used to love Charles. But after such a betrayal, I've come to dislike him. I'm sorry to both of you, but I'll be seeking a divorce." I conveyed this to my in-laws, who had taken care of me in so many ways. My father-in-law responded, "Of course. We'll make sure Charles takes responsibility for this. We truly apologize for everything." He sincerely apologized to me and was getting teary eyes. Although I told him he doesn't need to apologize to me, he kept his silence and looked apologetic for a while. Then, my in-laws took Charles and Linda and left. I remained in the house, feeling a mix of sadness and regret, and cried. Later on, the divorce went through smoothly. Through the lawyer my father-in-law introduced me to, I demanded settlement from Charles and Linda. I was able to collect $10,000 from each of them. Being able to collect this amount was also thanks to my father-in-law. He apparently gave them both a long lecture when he took them home that day. "You betrayed Jennifer with what you all did. You all better show some real sincerity," he said. But neither Charles nor Linda had the money. Both of them liked to splurge on themselves. So, for the time being, my father-in-law fronted the $10,000 for each of them, and it seems Charles and Linda will repay him later. I'm nothing but grateful to my father-in-law. As for what happened to Charles and Linda afterward, turns out both of them left their jobs. Rumors about Charles and Linda had been circulating in the company for a while. And when my divorce with Charles was finalized, their relationship came to light. Given the circumstances, the company felt the need to take some action. Their solution? Transfer him to a remote branch. Charles was moved to a tiny branch office in rural area with just a handful of employees. There was absolutely nothing fun around that branch. Apparently, he couldn't handle it, so he resisted and decided he was gonna quit. Of course, his resignation was accepted right away. Linda, being a contract employee, wasn't offered a contract renewal. There had always been negative talk about her in the company, and this incident seemed to be the last straw. An old colleague, who I was close with at my previous company, filled me in on all this. I thought to myself, they got what they deserved. It is what it is. Around the time Charles left his job, he called my cell phone multiple times. At first, I ignored him, but he was so persistent that I finally picked up. "What do you want now?" When I answered, Charles said in a desperate voice, "Finally! Please, you gotta help me out." From what Charles shared, he'd been job hunting since he left his previous job but hadn't been able to secure a new position. He'd been living with his parents, so he was getting by. However, one day, his father-in-law told him to sell his car to repay a debt of $10,000. After selling the car and giving the $10,000 to his father-in-law, he was told, "You're no longer needed here. Go wherever you want and live your life." It seemed Charles had been essentially disowned. "I tried asking Linda, but she's in a similar situation with no money. The only person I can rely on is you. Can you please help me out?" He pleaded. "Why would I help someone who did what you did? We're strangers now." I firmly told Charles off. Yet, Charles wouldn't give up. "Actually, I'm right outside your house now. Can you let me in?" Perhaps because he was desperate, Charles wouldn't back down. So, I calmly told him, Someone else is living in that house now, you know? I've moved away and live somewhere completely different. In fact, I'd rented that house to someone else. The rent was covering the mortgage, so it's breaking even for now. Well, Charles must have been really shocked, as his voice trailed off towards the end. I don't think we'll ever see each other again, so, goodbye. I told Charles that and hung up the phone without waiting for a response. Then, I immediately blocked Charles's number. 3 years have passed since then. I'm as busy as ever. However, one major thing has changed. That's having a child. Turns out, I met someone new after that and got remarried, giving birth to a healthy baby boy. I love my husband, he's really sweet, but oh boy, my child is just adorable. Right now, I'm on parental leave, taking care of my child every day. Of course, I absolutely love the hustle and bustle of work. That's never gonna change. But the cuteness of my own child? That's unbeatable. Even though every day is super hectic, I'm looking forward to spending fun times with my family of 3. How I spend my money is none of your business. If you have a problem with it, you can get out of here. My mother-in-law, who firmly believes the money I earn is hers and spends it as she pleases. And my husband, who simply turns a blind eye and never even bothers to admonish her. Every day I lose a little more patience with the two of them. How long must I continue to live this way? Honestly, I've been at my breaking point. Fine. I'll do as you say. I'll leave this house. Please never contact me again. My name is Ruby, a 34-year-old remote worker. 2 years ago, I married my husband Matthew, and now we live together with his mother. Matthew was raised in a single-parent household, apparently had a hard time growing up and told me he had endured countless hardships. I want to make things easier for my mom. Matthew would often say during our courtship, and I fell for Matthew because of his gentle side. Being an only child myself, perhaps because I was the sole recipient of my parents' love, I had feelings of gratitude towards them and wanted to repay them in some way. Maybe that's why Matthew and I were able to sympathize with each other on that point. Afterward, we, who had been co-workers at the same company, decided to get married after a few years of dating. We talked about various things for the future after getting married, like where we would live, or saving money to buy a house, but our workplaces were far from both of our parents' homes, and we didn't even imagine living together at the time. Also, the first time I met my mother-in-law was during our marriage proposal, and her impression was far from the kind mother Matthew always talked about. To be honest, I felt she was someone I should absolutely avoid. So, you're Ruby, Matthew's fiancé? You're not what I imagined. I'm disappointed. I thought you were a cute, petite woman with a lovely smile. Huh? That's what my mother-in-law blurted out, barely paying attention to the greetings. Sure, at 5 feet 6 inches, I'm a bit tall for a woman, and my appearance is more stylish than pretty. Apparently, I wasn't what my mother-in-law had in her mind. Still, I never imagined being critiqued on my appearance at a first meeting. Naturally, as this was our first meeting, I couldn't respond with a joke. I simply laughed it off and pretended it didn't bother me. With the cold atmosphere that ensued, I thought Matthew would come to my rescue, but instead, he just listened to his mother's story and happily chuckled. Is it okay to marry this guy? That was the first question I had. But from what I heard, my mother-in-law had never been sick and seemed to be in good health. Her hobbies included traveling and shopping, and she had a lot of good friends in the area she was accustomed to. Also, she seemed to be actively engaging with the neighbors, so even if I had married Matthew, I believed she wasn't the type to frequently impose on our home. On the way back from our first meeting with her, I casually spoke to Matthew. Your mom is really lively, isn't she? She's never been sick, she must be very conscientious. It looks like she has lots of friends around the neighborhood, so I guess we don't have to worry about living together. Well, yeah. For now, she seems fine and I think she's okay. I have been thinking that at some point, I'll have to take care of her, but that's a future concern. Taking his words to heart, I stopped talking about my mother-in-law any further. To be honest, it was probably more of a relief. Regardless of what kind of person my mother-in-law might be, as long as my relationship with Matthew is good, there's no problem. If the issue of living together comes up decades from now, I'll deal with it then. That's how I decided to think. Shortly after, we got married. We had talked about having a grand wedding, but due to our busy work schedules, we had to postpone it. If anything, Matthew was looking forward to the wedding more than I was. He was like, "It's a once-in-a-lifetime wedding, so I want to invite everyone, coworkers, friends, relatives, and have a big celebration, and I'm sure Mom would be thrilled, too." He was saying things like that. I wasn't as keen, so I was actually grateful that work was so busy. However, around this time, I felt a growing gap between Matthew and me, as if a distance was forming in our hearts. We had different roles at work and somehow I ended up in a higher position than him, which I guess he wasn't very happy about it. "I heard a rumor that you got promoted to section manager, is that true? Why didn't you turn it down? You're going to quit when we have a baby, right?" "Quit work? I've never even thought about that. We agreed we would both continue to work after marriage, didn't we?" I understood that it was pure jealousy towards me, but I stayed silent, thinking that saying anything more would just hurt Matthew's pride. It was the only way to keep the peace. Our relationship remained awkward after that, and then Matthew said something utterly incomprehensible. "I've thought about it, and I want you to stay home and take care of the household. So quit your job and make things easier for me to work." Somehow, I had a hunch he might say something like that, and it was spot on. According to a good colleague, Matthew was apparently upset about my promotion and had been complaining quite a bit at work. He had been saying that I don't do any housework, that I laze around at home, that he does all the cleaning and laundry, even prepares all the meals. No, that's not true at all. Matthew has always left all the cleaning and laundry to me. He hasn't even pressed a button on the washing machine. While I thought this to myself, I couldn't tell anyone, and before I knew it, I was seen as a wife who had abandoned housework. Naturally, I wasn't happy about the bad rumors, so I confronted him directly. "Can you stop spreading weird rumors about me? That I don't do any housework? That's absolutely not true. I'm the one doing everything, right? I even prepare your lunches every day." I raised my voice, which was unusual, and he seemed surprised at first, but then he immediately retaliated. "See? You never try to support me. That's why you can't handle anything. It's impossible to balance work and household chores, so just quit your job." I was too shocked to retort. What's going on in his head? I had more to say, but I decided to hold it in that day. But even after that, Matthew kept insisting I should quit my job. "If you say you won't quit your job, then we can divorce. I talked to Mom, and she said you should quit your job and take care of the household perfectly, too." Matthew, unsatisfied with just gossiping about me at work, had taken to blabbing to his mother about every little thing. It was ridiculous. Yet, despite it all, I stubbornly continued working. I couldn't bear the thought of our marital relationship falling apart. After a lot of thought, I finally decided to quit my job. However, in return, I made it clear that I wanted to work from home. He didn't object. "Huh? Working from home? Isn't that what people do to earn chump change? Well, if you're satisfied with that, I'll allow it. But I've got some conditions too." My husband grinned ominously. I was on edge, wondering what he would say next. "What do you mean, conditions? I'm quitting my job, isn't that enough? What more do you want from me?" How did my husband, Matthew, become so obnoxious? I can't even pinpoint when his personality took such a terrible turn. He started to resemble his mother so much, it's become a hassle just to talk to him. "Well, my mom is moving in with us next month. Her lease is up at the end of this month. So, she'll be living with us. Hope you don't mind." What? Is he serious? This can't be happening. However, everything seemed to have been planned out so meticulously that there was hardly any time for me to say wait a minute. The very next day, my mother-in-law called me. And she was like, "Ruby, I guess you've heard the news. I'll be moving out of my place at the end of this month." It's all quite sudden, but I'm counting on your support. She sounded so pleased with herself. Matthew, too, seemed thrilled as he overheard our conversation. In essence, his plan was to have me quit my job and take care of the two of them. I saw through his scheme right away. His mother said she would move in at the end of the month, but sure enough, she vacated her apartment within a week and moved into our house. She didn't lift a finger to help with the housework and instead complained constantly. She was like, "You should clean the rooms thoroughly. And your cooking is tasteless. Who taught you to cook? I'd like to meet your parents." My living hell began the day she moved in, and 2 years later, it's still ongoing. Before I knew it, my relationship with Matthew had completely chilled. I was treated as nothing more than a housemaid, taking care of the two of them. What I realized after living with her is that she is a big spender. She has a weak spot for designer brands, and she buys something new every time a new collection is released. She has more shoes, clothes, wallets, and bags than I can count. I tried talking to Matthew about it, but he brushed me off and he was like, "Mom's always been into fashion. Well, as long as she's happy, what's the harm?" By this time, neither Matthew nor my mother-in-law were contributing a cent to our household expenses. Matthew was using the money he earned for himself and my mother-in-law. As soon as she received pension, she would go shopping. I was fed up with the monotony of everyday life, even questioning what I was doing living here. Amidst all of this, my mother-in-law and Matthew proposed something outrageous. "Hey, Mom and I are thinking about going on a trip for a week starting next month. A vacation in Cancun, pretty cool, right? We'll even get you a souvenir." What? I was taken aback by the sudden announcement. Turns out, that day was my birthday. How come forgetting my birthday and going on a vacation to Cancun? That's unthinkable. You're kidding, right? You do realize what day it is, don't you? When I said this, my mother-in-law walked over and was like, "Of course we do. You even marked it on the calendar, right? Your birthday, isn't it? But, you know, such things don't really matter anymore." They laughed and smirked as they looked at me. Annoyed by their attitude, before I knew it, I was blurting out my frustrations. "Enough is enough! A vacation when you don't even pay for the living expenses? I've been paying for everything these past 2 years. After all, you made me quit my job, isn't that strange?" My face was bright red with anger, and I felt I could barely control myself. But they didn't care. My mother-in-law was like, "How I spend my money is none of your business. If you have a problem with it, you can get out of here. There's no proof you've been earning money in the first place." That was her response. Even though they were living off the money they took from me and spending it as they pleased, they dared to say such things. And my husband, who ignored my mother-in-law's words and didn't even bother to intervene, was like, "You were the one being supported, weren't you? You might have had to use some of your savings recently, but don't get all high and mighty." I was fed up with these two people in front of me. How long do I have to live like this? Honestly, I'm at my wit's end. "Fine. I'll do as you say. I'll leave this house. Please never contact me again. Matthew, this is the end for us. We're getting divorced, a divorce." Perhaps they were waiting for me to leave all along. They were grinning as if they had succeeded in their plan. Then, to my astonishment, my mother-in-law was like, "Perfect. Actually, we called a locksmith today. We were thinking about changing the locks after getting rid of the nuisance." That's what she said. I don't know what kind of plan they had, but it seems they conspired to kick me out of this house today. Mom, that's incredible. I didn't expect Ruby to decide to leave at this moment. You know, she's unexpectedly tenacious. I thought we'd have a tougher time, but it's all good, isn't it? These two clueless individuals were seemingly expecting to live comfortably in this house once they kicked me out. As if it would go so smoothly. "In less than an hour, the movers will arrive, so can you pack your stuff quickly? I'll dispose of the larger items as bulky waste, so please only take what you need." Oh, sure. Okay. I don't mind you changing the locks. But you both might want to get ready in various ways, too. I told them something ominous. Of course, they didn't seem to understand, and after that, I quickly left the house. After leaving, I had mountains of things to do. Honestly, I was so irritated that I was furious, but I was thinking of a way to calmly and carefully send these two to hell. Having made the rounds to various services, I decided to enjoy living in a hotel until I found a new place. I've hardly been able to afford luxuries before, so I decided to spend a few weeks in a luxury hotel suite. Feeling like a celebrity, I was excited about what was to come. And then, a few weeks later, I finally got a call. From the two of them, their voices sound completely desperate. Hello? Hey. Oh, that's me, Matthew. Oh, hey. What's up? Have you by any chance received a bunch of something? They sounded completely flustered, their voices shaking. And it seemed like my mother-in-law was right there with him. I could hear a voice in the background. So? What do you want? Well, what do I want, you ask? You should know, right? We got a call from the lawyer about a divorce, and also an eviction notice within a week. This is too much, no matter what. I never even said I wanted a divorce. This is just too selfish. Let's make up each other. Matthew, about to cry, was asking for reconciliation, even at this point. From my perspective, I was like, what's gotten into this guy? After all, they forcibly took over the house I had been living in, changed the locks, and drove me out, and I was the one who owned the house. And my mother-in-law was pretty flustered, too, and she took over the phone to try to persuade me. Listen, Ruby, the divorce thing is a lie, right? Matthew and we didn't mean what we said like that. You understand, right? We just said it as a joke, but you're taking it seriously. Matthew's as Matthew does, but my mother-in-law is apparently quite an oddball, too. Well, I guess it's like the saying, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, you know? Well, considering I was the one who got kicked out, there's no way I can make up with you. And all this time, you've been using my money, so don't mess around. Huh, but isn't that money what Matthew earned? Whatever I use the money my son earned on, that's none of your business, right? Even after explaining it before, she still seems to be completely clueless. She must have been under the impression that the money I earned belonged to Matthew. I couldn't help but let out a deep sigh when Matthew asked me as if something just occurred to him. Hey, just how much are you earning? It's strange that you own that detached house, and you've been living the same lifestyle even after quitting your job. I've never given you a cent, you know? It seems he finally realized it. And then, this guy just said it out loud. That he's not paid a single cent. Well, since we're going to be strangers anyway, I might as well tell him the truth. It'd be good for him to realize that the one that got away was a big catch. My earnings? I didn't really want to tell you, but I'll let you know. I make about $20,000 a month on average. I even paid off the mortgage on the house over the past 2 years. Actually, I've been the one supporting you and your mother all this while. What? $20,000? You're lying. There's no doubt that both Matthew and my mother-in-law must be regretting this. After all, you can't live a luxurious life on Matthew's salary alone. You see now? We used to work at the same place, so I knew roughly how much you earned. A net income of $2,000 was really tough, right? I was amazed that you even suggested to quit my job and became a housewife. Quite the character, huh? No, it's not like that. I've been working hard, believing that I could become a department head like you someday. So, you know. It seems Matthew is under the impression that he's a capable man. He's never managed to get a position higher than a regular employee, despite being older than me, and it's clear from the company's evaluation of him. It seems like a waste of time even to bother with him. Well, I have no intention of making up with you. After all, your mother, who's notorious for her reckless spending, would inevitably come with you. I don't want to lose any more things. Just move out of the house as soon as possible. Please, Ruby. Listen to me, please. I apologize for all the horrible things I've said up to now. So, please. Despite them insisting, I have no intention of forgiving them. They really are persistent. Even my mother-in-law was like, Ruby, you can ignore me, but could you please make up with Matthew? I'll leave right now. Please, I'm begging you. This is a once-in-a-lifetime request. Look, I apologize for everything. It seems my mother-in-law was apparently crying. Of course I won't change my mind whatever they say. So, I told you it's impossible. Anyway, I'm busy, so I'll talk to you later. Irritated, I hung up the phone. Knowing how stubborn I can be, Matthew didn't push me further. And as I told him, he soon found a new place to move to. He canceled the vacation they had planned, and quickly packed up and moved out of the house. His new home is a rundown apartment that's over 60 years old. It creaks so much that it feels like the roof might fly off and the walls might collapse if a hurricane comes. Well, considering he's been living it up on my dime all this time, I guess it's about time he starts living a life that's more in his league, right? Afterwards, Matthew reported his divorce to his company. I heard that he was pretty much the laughingstock among his bosses. The boss was like, "You're such an idiot for not cherishing a competent wife when you had one." Right in front of everyone. It seems like he's been whining about me all this time, but in reality, no one believed his stories. I hear they even told him that he got what he deserved for driving me away, right in his face. Hearing that story, I must say, was pretty satisfying. Ever since then, I've bought myself a brand new condo and I've been enjoying new life. With the freedom to spend my money and my time as I please, I'm planning to aim for even greater heights in my career. As I arrived at the next scenic spot in my rental car, the phone rang with a call from my mother-in-law, as if she had been watching the whole time. It was my mother-in-law. I gave my husband, David, a knowing look and answered. "Hello, Mrs. Johnson, what's up?" Her voice was frantic on the other end. "Get away from David right now. Grab your bag with your clothes and head to the bus stop by the cliffs." "Mrs. Johnson? What are you talking about?" "David's planning to attack you. He's got a gun hidden in the car." So, that was the game she was playing. I can't believe David would. "Okay, I'll leave right away." My response might have sounded a bit flat, but it seemed to have convinced her. She hung up immediately. My name's Emily Johnson, a 29-year-old office worker. I got married to David last year, but because of the COVID pandemic, we had only registered a marriage. Now that the pandemic's effects have waned, we've been able to travel. So, we're planning our belated honeymoon. My company was understanding and gave us time off for our honeymoon even though it's been a while since our marriage. We chose a national park, eager to take lots of pictures. I'm into landscape photography. David's hobby is video editing. We've even discussed starting a YouTube channel for landscape videos. We've been living a quiet but happy newlywed life. However, there's been one concern: David's mom, Mrs. Johnson. She has always been overly fond of David, her son. Since David and I decided to get married, she seemed to have it out for me at every turn. Her subtle harassments during our meetings are a frequent occurrence. And the worst part is that she does it behind David's back. If I get praised or say something at a family gathering, she'd subtly put me down. "Did you make this stew, Emily? It's an unusual recipe for around here, but it's tasty. It's really delicious. Can you share the stew recipe? If it's simple, I'd like to make it at home." "Did you like it? I'm glad. I'll write down the recipe for you right away." "It's good, Emily. But maybe learn some traditional recipes from around here too. It'll earn you more praises." That's how it usually goes. She's not praising my unique stew, she's suggesting I stick to the local recipes and not stand out. In fact, after the relatives left and it was just me and Mrs. Johnson doing the dishes, it was a barrage of sarcasm. "Always wanting to stand out, making such a salty stew. Planning on giving our family high blood pressure or something? Scary woman." "I tasted it, did you find it too salty?" I'll go lighter on the salt next time. I don't even want to eat your salty stew anymore. Make something more traditional next time. But then, when David comes around, her demeanor completely changes. Emily, Aunt Susan said thanks for the stew recipe. Everyone really seemed to love your dish. Really? That's great. What would you like to eat tomorrow, David? Emily and I will prepare it together. With a beaming smile, she'd interrupt our conversation, shifting the topic. It's so blatant that it's hard to even get angry about. It's become a bit of a joke for us afterward. The hilarious part is David's already caught on to her dual-faced behavior and subtle digs. Mrs. Johnson thinks her son doesn't notice, and takes every chance to berate me when he's not around. However, my husband David has already caught on, and even secretly records or films her when it gets too bad. David has always resented his mother's overbearing love, which is really just over-interference. Apparently, it's even crushed his dreams for the future. So, when we got married, it was David, not me, who refused to live with her. Despite the happy occasion, it seems like Mrs. Johnson thinks I was the one who manipulated him. Her excessive love for her son blinds her to everything around her. I worry she'll do something foolish one of these days. On another note, we've finally decided on the details for our belated honeymoon. Taking our hobbies into consideration, we decided on a trip around scenic locations within the country. I'm excitedly preparing cameras and other equipment. David is also getting a smartphone without a SIM card to take videos. We've packed a traveling bag with clothing and toiletries. We'll be able to see canyons and waterfalls on this trip. I want to take beautiful pictures, so we need to check the weather forecast too. You're right. Landscapes shrouded in mist and clouds are mysterious and beautiful, but I really hope it's sunny. We laughed together as we continued our preparations. But even at a time like this, Mrs. Johnson interferes. A phone call. It's Mrs. Johnson as expected. Hello. I answered the phone in front of David and quickly switched it to speakerphone. Hello, Emily? Are you really planning on traveling with David? You've been married for over a year, and now you're going on a honeymoon. What are you thinking? It seems she wants to stop me from traveling with my husband. The best response to this is to flaunt the trip. Of course. We finally don't have any restrictions. David's company and mine have approved the leave for our honeymoon, and we're going to enjoy ourselves to the fullest. Mrs. Johnson fell for my bait. What do you mean enjoy yourselves? It's probably just a cheap inn and a miserable trip. I feel sorry for David. Mrs. Johnson's words caused David to frown in silence. This trip was something David had arranged himself without relying on a travel agency. I looked at David's face and changed my tone. Oh, no, it's not a cheap inn at all. David arranged everything. We're staying at a super luxury hotel with an amazing view. Of course, the food is 5-star too. And yet, it's all at a very affordable price. I purposely spoke sweetly to provoke Mrs. Johnson. I'm always being picked on, and this time she was disparaging the trip that David prepared. I wouldn't feel satisfied without getting back at her a little. A super luxury hotel? Why are you going with David? Let me go on that trip. David would want to show his filial piety to me. It seems she couldn't keep quiet after hearing about the super luxury hotel. Now she's saying she wants to go on the trip herself. No mother would but in on a honeymoon like this. It's not gonna happen. Taking over your son and daughter-in-law's long-awaited honeymoon is just uncouth. We'll be sure to buy you a souvenir. Goodbye. Imagining Mrs. Johnson's frustrated face, I hung up the phone. I laughed spitefully, and David was holding his head in front of me after I hung up. Emily, I'm sorry about my mom. I can't believe she tried to take over our honeymoon. Well, she loves her son so much, she probably just wanted to say something. It's not something to worry about. I smiled at David, but I also felt a twinge of anxiety. I had beaten her at her own game with all the resentment I had built up, but I might have failed. What if the angry Mrs. Johnson became obsessed with our honeymoon and started harassing us? This worry of mine would later prove to be true. From then until the departure of the trip, there was silence from Mrs. Johnson, not even a phone call. I had expected her to complain to David about me, but that didn't happen either. Her silence was unnerving, but we went on our honeymoon as planned. David's choice of scenic locations went off without a hitch, and I was completely satisfied. The super luxury hotel I had boasted about to Mrs. Johnson was top-notch in every way: the view, the amenities, the food, everything. We even had the hotel staff take a picture of us enjoying dinner as a couple. Oh, I'm so full. David, thank you so much for arranging all this. After dinner, I collapsed on the bed in the hotel room. The bed's so soft and comfy too. Watching me happily roll around in bed, my husband David exclaimed with joy. I'm glad you like it. Once you've rested your stomach, how about we go to the spa? In the meantime, I'll check the videos and photos we took today. The spa? How wonderful. David, who had been opening his laptop while admiring me enjoying the plush bed, suddenly raised his voice after a while. What? What's going on here? Feeling an unusual sense in David's voice, I got out of bed and peered into his computer. We had rented a car to get around today. At every scenic spot we visited, we had parked the rental car and taken videos and photos, and the rental car could be seen in the background here and there. In itself, that wasn't a problem, but there were a few instances where a suspicious person, who appeared to be a small-framed woman, was lurking around the rental car. We couldn't see the face of the suspicious person, but we felt she was a petite woman. The suspicious person was occasionally opening the car door. Oh, here, we didn't lock the car because we were only there for a short time, David muttered, pointing at the screen. I recognized the hat the suspicious person was wearing. Hey, this hat, doesn't Mrs. Johnson have one like this? Yes, Mrs. Johnson has a similar hat. David's face turned pale at my words. That's right, this is my mother's hat. David and I stared intently at the computer screen. The suspicious person, who looked like Mrs. Johnson, was putting something black into the rental car. It looked like she was opening the traveling bag that had been left in the rental car. Then, after a while, the suspicious person left without taking anything. Was something put into the traveling bag? I hurriedly dumped out it. It felt strangely heavy. I hadn't noticed the difference in weight since the hotel bellman had carried it when we arrived at the hotel. It was a bag with clothing and toiletries, no valuables. Nothing seemed to be stolen. And then, something unbelievable rolled out from the bottom of the bag. David and I were stunned by what had come out. What's this? You're kidding. The next morning, we left the hotel with exhausted faces. We had been run ragged dealing with the incredible thing that had come out of the bag the previous day. When we arrived at the next scenic spot in the rental car, the phone rang with almost perfect timing. It was from Mrs. Johnson. I signaled to David, who was on the phone, to answer it. Hello, Mrs. Johnson? What's going on? Mrs. Johnson's voice on the other end of the phone sounded quite frantic. Get away from my son right now. Grab the bag with the change of clothes and head to the Cape's bus stop. Wait, how does she know there's a bus stop near the Cape where we're vacationing? And how does she know the details of our luggage, like the bag with the change of clothes? Since she called at the perfect timing, she's probably hiding and watching somewhere. It was a call full of puzzling moments, but I deliberately asked Mrs. Johnson for a reason. Mrs. Johnson? What are you talking about? David is planning to attack you. He's hiding a gun in the car. I see, so that's the scenario. I already knew everything, but I pretended to go along with Mrs. Johnson's leading. That can't be, David attacking me? Okay, I understand. I'll get away right now. Although my response was a bit wooden, I seemed to have successfully fooled Mrs. Johnson. Mrs. Johnson hung up immediately. I signaled to David, who was driving, and headed for the bus stop with the traveling bag. Of course, I didn't forget to pretend to be scared. And then I called the police. About 5 minutes later, I arrived at the Cape's bus stop, and a detective in an unmarked police car approached me. Well, it turned out just like you said yesterday. I never thought you'd really call it in. The detective looked troubled. I'm truly sorry for involving you in this farce. I think David should be catching Mrs. Johnson by now, so please come with me. I headed back to the rental car, and the detective followed me in his unmarked car. From the parking lot where we parked the rental car, I could hear Mrs. Johnson's voice. Hey, David? How did you know where I was? It seemed that Mrs. Johnson had never dreamed that her wicked scheme would be exposed in advance. She was caught by my husband, hiding in the shadows of a gazebo in the parking lot. Not today. I will not forgive you today. Mrs. Johnson was frightened by her husband's demon-like expression, but she was even more astonished when she saw me returning with the detective. In my hand was a traveling bag, just as Mrs. Johnson had planned. Upon seeing it, Mrs. Johnson started to scream. Officer, arrest that woman right away. She's hiding a gun in that bag. She's trying to kill my son with it. Mrs. Johnson shouted that and smirked at me. A triumphant look on her face. I silently stood before Mrs. Johnson and dumped the contents of the bag. Out of respect for the men's eyes, the underwear was placed in a small bag so that it could not be seen. However, the object Mrs. Johnson was after was nowhere to be found. What? Why isn't the gun there? I put it there yesterday, it should be there. Is this the gun you are looking for? The detective showed Mrs. Johnson a photo. It was a picture of a hunting rifle placed in a plastic bag. Upon seeing the photograph the detective presented, Mrs. Johnson's face turned pale. That hunting rifle, it belonged to my late father-in-law, didn't it? Honestly, how did you manage to open the gun safe? I thought my heart would stop when I found it yesterday. I called the police right away and handed it over. At mine and my husband's voices, Mrs. Johnson ground her teeth and looked down. Oh, since it was in Emily's bag, it's Emily's fault. I have nothing to do with it. Mrs. Johnson started yelling in desperation. My husband and I sighed deeply. But then, the detective approached Mrs. Johnson with a big smile on his face. Yeah, because it was in Emily's bag, we had to ask her about it. We spent hours questioning her yesterday, even though it was supposed to be a vacation. So, how did you know the hunting rifle was in Emily's bag? Although the detective's face was smiling, his voice was low. It's no wonder he's angry. After all, the hunting rifle was taken out illegally, even though it was unloaded. But, I saw Emily put it in her bag. Mrs. Johnson, unable to look the detective in the face, desperately made excuses. Oh, so you saw Emily's travel preparations. But you and Emily's family are separated, aren't you? I chimed in with an obvious response. Of course we're separated, and we haven't let her into our house for a year. At that remark, Mrs. Johnson yelled back. Don't speak out of turn. The detective pressed Mrs. Johnson further. Oh my, were you spying on Emily's house? If so, that's a misdemeanor, and I'm gonna have to ask you to come to the station with us. Upon hearing the detective's line, straight out of a police drama, Mrs. Johnson panicked. I wasn't spying. I put that gun in there. So you can't take me involuntarily. Ah, she spilled the beans all by herself. Well, I had already said it earlier when I turned the bag inside out. The detective, who had been smiling until now, became serious. Yes, a confession. You'll be coming with us voluntarily for violating the gun law. At the detective's words, Mrs. Johnson opened her mouth in shock. What? Why? I said I wasn't spying, didn't I? Mrs. Johnson's objection was met with her son's fury. It's only natural, Mom. You don't have a hunting license, and you took Dad's gun without permission. If the father-in-law, who had a hunting license, carried it legally for the prescribed purpose, there would be no problem. But you don't have a hunting license, so taking it out of the gun safe is out of bounds. It seemed that Mrs. Johnson knew nothing about gun laws or handling. Even though the live ammunition was stored separately and not loaded into the gun itself, it's a wonder she managed to bring it this far without an accident. Yet Mrs. Johnson still resisted. But when it was found at the hotel, it must have been in that woman's bag. That woman stole it from my house. It's not my fault. At the unsightly attitude of Mrs. Johnson, her son raised his voice. Yesterday, I caught the moment on video when Mom put a gun in our rental car. Naturally, I showed it to the police. David's words made Mrs. Johnson's knees buckle. What? How did you find out? Frustration and tears welling up in her eyes, I explained in his stead. David was filming yesterday, and he caught the parking lot in the shot. We didn't notice it at the time, but when we were reviewing the video at the hotel, we saw it. Mrs. Johnson could no longer argue with my explanation. Now, Mrs. Kate Johnson, we'd like you to accompany us to the station on suspicion of violating gun control laws. The detective prompted Mrs. Johnson, who was in a state of shock, to get up. To Mrs. Johnson, David exclaimed, "Why would you do something like this? Just because you don't like Emily? I've had enough. I'm cutting ties with you, Mom." At David's words, Mrs. Johnson suddenly began to scream and thrash about. Why? Why is that woman better than me? David, are you abandoning your mom? The detective forced the screaming Mrs. Johnson into the unmarked patrol car. You might not want to make too much of a fuss. When I called the house yesterday to check the gun's serial number, your son's grandmother, I guess, an elderly woman, was furious. Eek! At the detective's words, Mrs. Johnson immediately calmed down. The grandmother in question is David's grandmother. Although elderly, she's still in good health, with no signs of dementia. She's practically the head of the Johnson household. Mrs. Johnson is in a state of complete submission to her. Even though she's the head of the household, she's not an unreasonable person towards others. Whenever I visit the in-laws, she's always so happy to see me, affectionately calling me Emily dear. She's a kind person. Though strict with Mrs. Johnson about household chores, she took care of her own room and private bathroom. It must have been quite something to make her so angry. As I muttered under my breath, the detective informed me. Apparently, since your father-in-law's death, your husband's grandmother has been keeping the hunting rifle as a keepsake. But the box with the keepsake in it was ransacked the other day. Upon learning that this led to the recent commotion, she was incredibly furious. The detective exaggerated a shiver. I see, Mrs. Johnson must have ransacked her room to get the key. It's not hard to imagine her anger at having her son's keepsake disturbed. Afterwards, David spoke to the detective. I'm not gonna pick up Mom at the police station after this. At David's words, Mrs. Johnson's face changed to one of despair. The detective laughed and waved as he explained. Yeah, David and Emily, you continue your vacation. Your grandmother insists on it, and her representative is on the way here. With that, the detective left with Mrs. Johnson. David heaved a big sigh. Emily, I'm really sorry. Our vacation turned into this. It's okay, it ended without incident. Let's just enjoy the trip, shall we? I said, and David looked relieved. Then he quietly told me. I'm relieved that it's not Grandma coming, but her representative. When Grandma gets really mad, she's terrifying. If she had come this time, she might have torn down the police station with her loud yelling. After that, we were able to enjoy our vacation, taking lots of lovely photos and videos and making good memories. Mrs. Johnson was not arrested but was sent to court for violating gun control laws. Fined or imprisoned or both, she's now anxiously awaiting the trial's outcome. After we returned from our trip, my husband's grandmother apologized for Mrs. Johnson's behavior. She blamed herself for leaving her son's keepsake hunting rifle locked in the house, leading to all this trouble, and apologized in tears. We decided to have the local police dispose of the hunting rifle. When handing over the rifle at the station, I asked to take a picture of it for her, so she could at least keep a photograph as a memento. My husband's grandmother, who had cried and apologized to me and David, was ruthless with Mrs. Johnson. According to a relative who went to pick her up, she lectured Mrs. Johnson in a voice that echoed throughout the neighborhood for over 30 minutes. Oh, so your grandma really does get that angry. That's why Mom always obeyed Grandma completely. Now the whole neighborhood knows about Mom's wrongdoing. Yes, thanks to his grandma's lecture, the incident became widely known, and Mrs. Johnson could no longer walk the streets. After learning that David had severed ties with her, his grandmother obtained permission from the police station and prosecutor's office and sent Mrs. Johnson to a farm run by a relative, located in a basin-like area in the remote mountains in Nebraska. Even if she wanted to return here, it would take about 3 hours by car. Working herself to exhaustion on the farm, escaping would surely be impossible. After a while, it was discovered that I was pregnant. My husband, his grandmother, and the relatives were all thrilled. His grandmother was already caught up in great-grandchild fever and began to strengthen her legs. She seems to be planning to compete with my husband to take the baby for walks in the stroller. To make sure she doesn't drop the great-grandchild when holding it, she's also started working on her upper body strength. It's good to see her, who was quite downcast because of Mrs. Johnson's fuss, getting her spirits back. Today, my husband and I are getting all the baby gear together. If it's with your grandma, I'd like to live together. She's really happy about it, and it seems like she'll live a long time after the baby is born. Taking care of the baby with grandma, we're gonna manage somehow, huh? Well, if she's gonna live longer, I'll be happy too, and I'll talk to grandma about it. I picked up the camera. When the baby is born, I'm gonna take lots of pictures of the baby, my husband, his grandma, and family photos as well. With such thoughts, I was rubbing my belly.